Section 1. There's a story I heard as a child that has never really left me. Not because of bloodshed, not because of some terrifying chase through the woods, and not because anyone actually died. What makes it disturbing is that everything seemed completely normal. For years, an old family friend named Nikki told me this story whenever the topic of hitchhiking came up. She treated it as a life lesson, something she felt people needed to hear. Every time she told it, the details stayed exactly the same. And every time she reached the ending, a strange look would settle across her face. It happened in the early 1980s. Nikki was in her mid-20s at the time, living in a small town where people still believed in helping strangers. If someone was stranded on the side of the road, you stopped. If someone needed assistance, you offered it. That was simply how she had been raised. On a mild afternoon, she was driving into the city, a trip that usually took about 2 hours. The road stretched endlessly through quiet countryside, broken only by occasional farms, gas stations, and patches of forest. About 30 minutes into the drive, she noticed a lone figure walking along the shoulder. As she approached, the man turned toward her vehicle and raised his thumb. A hitchhiker. Most drivers would have continued past without slowing down. Nikki didn't. She eased her car onto the shoulder and rolled down the window. "Need a ride?" she asked. The man stepped closer. According to Nikki, he appeared ordinary, maybe in his late 20s or early 30s. He carried a worn travel bag over one shoulder. His clothes looked clean enough, though slightly weathered. Nothing about him immediately triggered alarm bells. "Yeah," he said politely, "if you're heading into the city." His voice was soft, almost shy. "Hop in." The passenger door clicked open. The stranger thanked her, tossed his bag into the back seat, and settled into the passenger side. As Nikki pulled back onto the highway, she had no idea she had just invited someone into her car who would later reveal a secret so horrifying it would haunt her for the rest of her life. Section 2. At first, the drive felt completely uneventful. The stranger introduced himself casually, and before long the two were engaged in ordinary conversation. They talked about current events, friends, work, the news. Nothing unusual, nothing threatening. The kind of small talk people make simply to pass time during a long drive. As mile after mile disappeared beneath the tires, Nikki found herself becoming increasingly comfortable around him. He seemed respectful, intelligent, and surprisingly easy to talk to. If anything, he appeared grateful. The highway rolled beneath a pale afternoon sky while fields and trees drifted past the windows. Occasionally another vehicle would pass, but for long stretches they had the road almost entirely to themselves. Looking back, Nikki would later tell me there was never a single moment during that drive when she felt afraid. Not once. Roughly halfway to the city, they stopped at a roadside diner attached to a gas station. It was the sort of place travelers often visited during long drives. A simple building glowing beneath fluorescent lights, with the smell of coffee and fried food drifting through the air. The stranger admitted he hadn't eaten much recently. Money had been tight. In fact, that was one of the reasons he was hitchhiking in the first place. Nikki listened sympathetically. When it came time to pay, she quietly covered the bill. The reaction caught her off guard. The man immediately became uncomfortable. "No, really, you don't have to do that," he insisted. "It's fine," Nikki replied with a smile. "Don't worry about it." He looked genuinely embarrassed, almost shaken. For several moments he stood there arguing politely before finally giving in. "Thank you," he said quietly. Something about his expression seemed different afterward. Not dangerous, not angry, just thoughtful. The two returned to the car and continued toward the city. The atmosphere remained friendly, but Nikki noticed the stranger had become quieter than before. He still answered questions and participated in conversation, yet every so often she caught him staring out the window as though lost in deep thought. At the time, she assumed he was simply tired. She had no way of knowing a battle was taking place inside his head. A battle she couldn't see. A battle that would determine whether she made it home alive. Section 3. As the city skyline finally appeared in the distance, the stranger seemed relieved. Traffic gradually increased. The empty stretches of highway gave way to busy roads, storefronts, and clusters of buildings. Eventually they reached downtown. "This is good," the man said. "You can drop me off here." Nikki pulled over near the curb. The stranger gathered his belongings and turned toward her. For a moment, he simply sat there. Then he smiled. "Thank you," he said sincerely. "For everything." "You're welcome," "No, really. Thank you." He seemed unusually emotional. The ride had only lasted a couple of hours, yet he spoke as though she had done something much larger. Before stepping out, he hesitated again. "Can I ask you something?" "Sure. Could I get your phone number?" Nikki was surprised but not alarmed. Remember, this was a different era. People were generally more trusting. Besides, they had spent hours talking. The stranger had been polite the entire trip. "Maybe we can catch up sometime," he said. The request seemed harmless. Nikki scribbled her number onto a piece of paper and handed it over. He folded it carefully and slipped it into his pocket. "Thanks again." Then he stepped out onto the sidewalk and disappeared into the crowd. As Nikki drove away, she felt good about herself. Helping someone in need felt rewarding. She had given a struggling traveler a ride, bought him a meal, provided a little kindness during what sounded like a difficult period of his life. That should have been the end of the story. In fact, if you had asked Nikki that day whether anything unusual had happened, she would have said no. Everything had gone perfectly. A stranger needed help. A kind person offered it. Everybody benefited. But that sense of comfort wouldn't last. Days passed. Life returned to normal. Then, roughly a week later, the phone rang. It was an ordinary call on an ordinary day. Nothing about the sound seemed unusual. Yet when Nikki answered, she unknowingly stepped into the most chilling conversation of her entire life. A conversation that would completely change the way she viewed that seemingly pleasant trip forever. Section 4. Hello. The moment Nikki spoke, a familiar voice answered. It was him, the hitchhiker. At first she felt pleased. She remembered the long drive and wondered how he was doing. Maybe he had found work. Maybe he was calling simply to say thanks again. But before she could say anything else, the man continued speaking. And he didn't stop. His words came quickly, urgently, as though he had rehearsed this conversation many times. "Nikki," he said, "you need to thank God for the way you were raised." The statement immediately confused her. She tried to respond, but he kept going. His tone was calm, too calm, the kind of calm that feels wrong. "You were kind to me," he continued, "kinder than anybody has been in a long time." Nikki sat silently, trying to understand what he was talking about. Then he said something that caused every ounce of warmth to vanish from her body. "When I first got into your car," he paused, "I planned to kill you." The room seemed to freeze. Nikki later told me she couldn't even process what she was hearing. For a second, she genuinely wondered if she had misunderstood him. But then he explained, slowly, clearly. He told her that when she stopped for him on that roadside, he had already decided what he intended to do. His plan was to wait until they reached the diner. After that, he intended to assault her, murder her, steal her car, and leave her body somewhere along the road. He described it matter-of-factly, as though discussing something he had once considered purchasing. Nikki couldn't speak, couldn't breathe, couldn't even interrupt. Every memory from that day suddenly transformed into something sinister. The friendly conversations, the shared meal, the laughter, all of it now carried a horrifying new meaning. The man continued, and what he said next somehow made the story even more disturbing. Because according to him, something changed. Not because he became afraid, not because he got caught, and not because he lacked opportunity. Something far simpler stopped him. Kindness. Section 5. The stranger explained that during the drive, Nikki had treated him like a human being. Not a burden, not a threat, not a problem, just a person. She had listened to him, talked with him, shared stories, bought him dinner when he admitted he had no money, and she had done it all without expecting anything in return. According to the man, every mile they traveled made his original plan harder to carry out. By the time they left the diner, he found himself struggling with something he hadn't expected: guilt. The image of harming her no longer matched the person sitting beside him. He told Nikki that after everything she had done for him, he couldn't go through with it. He couldn't live with himself. The confession hung in the air between them. Nikki remained frozen, listening, trying to comprehend the reality that she had unknowingly spent hours trapped in a car with someone who had been considering her murder. The stranger's voice softened. Then came the final words she would ever hear from him. "Please, Nikki." A pause. "Please never, ever pick up another hitchhiker." The sentence landed with more force than any threat could have. Not because he was warning her about himself, because he was warning her about everyone else. The line went silent. Then the call disconnected. Just like that. Gone. For several moments, Nikki simply sat there holding the receiver. The house felt unnaturally quiet. Eventually, she tried calling the number back. Her hands trembled as she dialed. Ring, ring, ring. A payphone answered. Nothing more. No name. No explanation. No way to identify him. No way to find him. And no way to know whether his story was entirely true. What Nikki did know was this. A man had entered her vehicle carrying violent intentions. A few hours later, he walked away without carrying them out. Years have passed since she first told me that story. Yet whenever hitchhiking comes up, I think about that phone call. I think about that lonely highway. I think about how close she may have come to never making it home. And I think about the stranger's final warning. A warning delivered not by a victim, not by a police officer, but by the man who claimed he had almost become her killer. Since hearing Nikki's story, I've followed that advice without exception. No matter how stranded someone appears, no matter how harmless they seem, I will never pick up a hitchhiker.